Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and today I am going to rank all the classes in the game as of patch 7.4 from best to worst for arenas. Now I have done tier lists in the past, but those were mostly focused on 8v8 war zones. And when we talk about arenas, there's a couple of differences that we need to keep in mind. Of course, the main difference between arena and warzone gameplay is that in arena, there is no respawn, there is no revives, nothing like that. So the first kill matters a lot more compared to war zones. And that means the ability to reset a fight using a hard defensive cooldown. Something like stealthing out or even the bubble of the Sorcerer. Something that can reliably keep the enemy team from killing you is very good in arenas, and classes that have access to these cooldowns typically perform better. Also, there is a lot of variety when it comes to the games and the comps. You will have tank games, for example, or even games with tanks and healers and 2 DPS. And sometimes you will run into matches where 4 DPS on 2 teams are facing off. And in those 2 types of scenarios, the classes that perform well are also quite different. So when making this tier list, I took a look at, let's say, the average game that you can expect when queuing up for war zones. I am not really looking at queuing as a group of 4. So this is more if you're queuing solo or maybe with one friend, and the kinds of matches that you can expect. So without further ado, let's jump into it. And as always, we are starting with A like Annihilation. And Annihilation, similar to the Warzone tier list, is also not a great class in arenas. You will typically not be the first target because being a Marauder, you do have quite powerful defensive cooldowns. You can also stealth out, so it's typically not a good idea to focus a Marauder first. However, Annihilation is a melee dot class, which is not the best because you lack the burst to reliably take down a priority target. And then in tank and healer games, you are okay, but also not great. Other classes do better. They have better AoE, better dot spread potential. So Annihilation overall is just not in the best spot. Next, we look at Lightning. And for Lightning, there's different builds you can play. Of course, the Elemental Convection build, which I also made a guide on in the past, is very powerful in war zones when it comes to AoE. And in tank healer games, you can absolutely carry, especially when facing a bunch of melee. But then in 4 DPS games, if you're playing Elemental Convection and you're facing 1 or 2 Deception Assassins, you are gonna get slaughtered because you don't have access to Phase Walk. And since this tier list, again, is for both DPS games and tank healer games, I am putting Lightning in B tier. Marksman Sniper. Well, there's not much to say about Marksman Sniper. The only thing you can really do in arena is run away, hope the enemies ignore you. Well, you can do some burst, other classes can do more. So in order to make Marksman work in arena, you really need to be a lot better than your opponents. And that means it's just not a great class at all. It lacks damage, D tier. Vengeance Juggernaut is really good if you're in a tank healer game and your enemy team has a bunch of melee, because of its almost unlimited AoE potential. However, if you're in a 4 DPS game, because of the lack of a hard defensive cooldown, you are frequently going to be the first target, and there's not much you can do about it. And that's why I put Vengeance in C tier. Rage is a similar story, although it has better single target damage, the AoE potential is worse. On the defensive side, there's not much difference between both classes, but overall I slightly favor Rage above Vengeance, however not much, so I put Rage in C tier as well. Madness, the best of the specs when it comes to 8v8 war zones. There's not much to say about Madness, it has everything, and with the changes in patch 7.3.1, you now even have access to single target burst with the Plague Master build. You are a bit squishier than you used to be in previous patches, however Madness, because of its powerful control tools, strong defensive cooldowns, respectable damage, and even the possibility to spec into off heals, makes it, in my opinion, clearly the best DPS class for arenas at the moment. Pyrotech has been nerfed in patch 7.4 with the changes to its tactical superheated fuel, however it is still a really strong class. It is a little bit tankier than its burstier brother Advanced Prototype, and it does very well in tank healer games. In 4 DPS games, however, I would say it's only good, not great, but overall it's still a very strong class, so I'm putting it in A tier. Fury Marauder, again, being a Marauder, you're usually not going to be the first target, and it does have respectable damage. It is also not too complicated to play. Overall, I would say for arenas, I would slightly rank it above Rage. However, it doesn't really have the AoE potential to have a great impact in a tank healer game. So definitely not A tier, I would put it in B tier. Engineering can be one of the strongest specs in the game if played right. However, it is quite a hard spec to play, because especially in Arena you need to be able to kite the enemy, position well, and use your plasma probe to maximum efficiency. However, if you do that, then it's really a hard counter to melee classes, and its burst potential is only rivaled by the APPT. That being said, I think engineering is probably the strongest of the sniper specs when it comes to arenas, so you could argue to put this one in A tier, but there is a very high skill requirement, and if you ever mess up and you are caught out without your entrench, then you can get one shot very easily, so overall I would put it in B tier. Now I might be slightly biased on this one, but I will put Advanced Prototype PowerTech in B tier. Why do I say biased? Well, this is of course my main spec, and it is not the best in arenas, unfortunately, which is why I don't really play them all that often. And the reason AP is not good is because it lacks a reliable way out of the fight. So AP is really good in a war zone if you can jump in, do some damage, die, respawn, and jump in again. It is one of the best classes at pressuring an enemy. But of course in the arena there is no respawn, so if you die once, you're out of the match. And at the same time, AP of course is probably the most threatening class in the game because it has the biggest burst in the game. And combining these two things means that if you're playing APPT in Arena, you are usually going to be the first target. So similar to Rage and Vengeance, if you're being the first target and you don't have a way to stealth out or a damage immunity, then there is just not that much you can do to reliably influence a match. That being said, if the enemy messes up, you absolutely have the potential to also win the game by yourself by one-shotting an enemy in about 2 or 3 seconds. And this is why I would rank APPT above Rage or Vengeance, for example, because the damage potential is higher. Also, if we're talking about tank healer games, AP is very good in that scenario, because AP with Carbonize, and again, the great burst potential that it has, absolutely shines in those games where it has the support it needs. Overall, however, AP is not among the top classes for Arena, so I would put it only in B tier. Moving on to Carnage. Carnage I think is in a similar position as Fury. It has a little bit better single target damage, similar survivability, and both classes don't really have much in terms of AoE. They can be good in DPS games, however in tank healer games, if the tank knows what they're doing, there's not really much that Carnage and Fury can do. So overall I would rate them as average, which means B tier. Okay, next up, Hatred Assassin. This just kind of sucks for PvP, to be honest. It doesn't really have the burst that Deception has, neither the control. So in DPS games, you would rather play Deception. Of course, it does have stealth, but if you're running the 2 cloaks, then you're not running the damage tactical, which is the main thing that makes Hatred good in PvE. It's overpowered damage. So that's not really a thing in arenas either. So yes, you can stealth out and you can survive that way and hope that your team will carry you. But if you are hiding in stealth, then you're not really applying your dots. But if you're coming out of stealth and you apply your dots to everyone, which is what you want to do, then you kind of die because you're paper. So Hatred for arenas, it's not a great class. I would not recommend playing it, to be honest. Medicine Operative, similarly, I think this is probably the worst spec for arenas at the moment. It is just way too squishy, the single target heal is not that great, and if you ever eat a hard stun and mess up your breaker, you are absolutely toast. The only games where it's good is tank and healer if the enemy has a lot of dots, because the AoE potential is still very, very strong. But in all other games, medicine will just be outperformed by the other healers. And talking about those other healers, right now I would put Bodyguard all the way at the top in S tier. Bodyguard has everything you need for arenas, maybe except mobility. But then again, most arena maps are not really that big, so there's not a lot of movement required. Typically, you will run in and just fist fight the other team, and whoever dies first loses. And Bodyguard is really good at that, because not only do you have probably the strongest heals overall in PvP, single target and AoE both is very, very solid. You have interrupt immunities, you have very strong defensive cooldowns, some of them even usable when stunned. And you also have offensive potential and can support getting a kill with your Electronet. So Bodyguard very, very strong and definitely the best healer in PvP right now. Immortal is another spec that is very, very strong right now. The damage output is simply insane. If you know what you're doing, you can outdamage almost any DPS class in the game with it. It is not as tanky as Shield Tech, for example, but being a tank, you're typically not going to be targeted if the enemy players know what they're doing. So by simply existing, putting guard on a priority target, and most importantly also switching your guard, and then focusing on your taunts, your 2 4-second hard stuns, and your insane DPS running the Skank Tank build, Immortal is probably one of the best classes overall to carry arena games. Next we're looking at Arsenal. Now Arsenal has really suffered in Legacy of the Sith. I've talked about it in the past. So they have buffed it a couple of times, but it's still not good, and the main reason is that the damage is still not there. Now in Arena they kind of can be a punching bag, because if you use your defensive cooldowns right, it takes at least 1 million damage before an Arsenal mercenary really goes down. However, if you simply leave them alone or maybe kite them a little bit, they are just not all that threatening. So you kind of rely on your teammates to do most of the damage, because your burst is unreliable, which is not a good way to win a lot of games. And this is why I would put Arsenal Mercenary in C tier only. Next we have Darkness Tank. I think Darkness is definitely the worst tank of the three. It doesn't have the same damage or control that Immortal has, and it is not as tanky and just not as annoying as Shield Tech. It is not a bad spec, however. I think you could argue overall putting this in B tier, but I'll put it in C tier simply because there's quite a noticeable difference in power compared to the other two tanks. So if you're playing Darkness, then at least for arenas, you're not really doing your team much of a favor. Innovative Ordnance theoretically has better damage than Arsenal, but a lot of it is dot based. Especially Serrated Shot being the only casted white damage dot in the game is just really terrible for arenas where everyone is going to have all of the defensive cooldowns before every round. So IO in my opinion is just a little bit worse version of the Arsenal Mercenary. It can tank a lot of damage, but it's not the easiest class to get your damage off. And in tank healer games it doesn't have the best spread damage as well. So overall I can only put it in D tier. But probably still above Hatred, because Hatred sucks. Okay, Corruption Sorcerer. So the Sorc heal I think is a very solid spec for PvP arenas. You need to know what you're doing. You can definitely not run in phase tank unless you want to get a bubble stun off on 4 melees or something. But it is very strong. It does have hard defensive cooldowns that can help you to outlive the enemy healer and win the game that way. The heals are good, although Bodyguard probably heals a bit more. But a well-played Corruption healer with the hard stun, a well-timed pull and the knockback can definitely win a lot of arena games. So I would put Corruption slightly below Bodyguard, but it's definitely a solid spec, better than average, so A tier. Okay, so now we get to Shield Tech, and I was considering to put this all the way on the top of the list, but I will actually put it just slightly behind Bodyguard, since Shield Tech also has been nerfed recently. And of course the nerfs were targeted at Pyro, in particular at the Superheated Fuel Tactical, but since Shield Tech Skank Tanks were also using the Tactical to boost their burst potential, after the nerfs, I mean Shield Tech is still a broken discipline to be honest, but I will put it slightly behind Bodyguard now, as currently the second best spec for arenas. What makes Shield Tech so good is that the damage is really good. Your main filler applies a heal debuff to everyone, so melee cannot play the game. You have access to Stealth Scan, which further destroys melees, but also any range. Because you have 2 pulls, you can control ranges really well. And of course you have Carbonize as a hard stun, which is also great in arenas. On top of that, you are really tanky, so you are just really the full complete package. And whether it's a tank healer game or a game with tank and 3 DPS, Shield Tech is always good. So really a class without too many weaknesses, that means clearly S tier. Next we have Virulence. I would rank Virulence slightly below NG, simply because NG has better burst potential. Virulence, I think it's a solid spec. It does have good DPS, it's good in tank and healer games, and if you know how to play it, it can be really hard to lock down. However, yeah, as I said, similar to NG, if you make any mistakes, you can go to one shot. So I would put it in B tier, probably similar power level to a PPT. Next up, Deception Assassin, and I had some discussions on this one with Kiddo. I ranked it in S tier first of all, because it is in my opinion probably the best class in 4 DPS versus 4 DPS games. However, he had a good point that if you're playing in a tank and healer game, Deception is just quite useless if the enemy tank knows what he's doing. If you're simply fast enough with a guard on whoever Deception is bursting, then the class becomes quite useless, because a lot of its power is tied to the 6-second burst window, which you will have with Shadowcraft after you exit from stealth. And if the tank counters this burst with a taunt or a guard or a stun or really anything, then Deception doesn't have much else. It can get kited quite easily, the sustained DPS is not the best, and it doesn't have any AoE whatsoever. However, because of 2 cloaks and its burst damage, and most tanks not really knowing what they're doing in PvP, I will still put Deception at the top of A tier. Alright, next we have Concealment. And Concealment is a little bit better for arenas than it is for war zones, because again, you do have stealth, you are hard to kill, and technically in arena, it's the last man standing who wins, not who gets the first kill. And Concealment is pretty good at forgetting to die. The burst damage is also good, which is another nice thing for arenas, but then again, in tank healer games, if the enemy has a shield tech, a Madness Sorc, and let's say a Pyro, Concealment is nothing more than a Warzone training dummy, as you're gonna get kited and slowly wither down. So this time Concealment doesn't go in D tier, but I will put it in C tier and probably somewhere at the bottom in C tier, to be honest. Now for whatever reason Virulence is double in this list, so I'll just ignore that. And the last class we can rank is Lethality. So Lethality Operative, I will put it in A tier, and the reason why is a little bit meta related. If you look at the classes that are good, you mostly have Madness and you have classes such as Pyro, but also some of the other ranged classes. And even though Lethality is still very powerful with an 8-meter dot spread and a lot of sustained damage, defensive cooldowns and even off heals, it does not do too well into Madness or Pyro and doesn't have any single target damage to really carry those 4 DPS games. So while Lethality is certainly one of the most powerful DPS specs in the game, certainly for war zones, for arenas it's only good but not great. And that's why I put it in A tier. So this is how I see all the classes for arenas, but again, this is only my opinion. If you see it differently, let me know in the comments below. And as always guys, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.